Islamophobia. My name is Tariq, I'm going to be chairing the session tonight. I'm a member of the SWP from Birmingham. I think this meeting is quite important for us, really, at a time when Islamophobia seems to be increasing and increasing, heightening and heightening, and many people in this room will have been involved in struggles against Islamophobia. I think it's a really important meeting, and I'm really pleased that we've got an excellent turnout for this meeting. I'm very honoured myself, and I think we should all be honoured here today to be having Tariq come and speaking with us at Marxism this year. Tariq's been an activist for many years. He's written many books. His latest book is the completion of the Islam Quintet. It's entitled Night of the Golden Butterfly. There's only one available on the stall here today, but there's plenty more available in the box as well. There's plenty more books of Tariq's you can come and take a look at the end as well. So without further ado, please do a warm welcome to Tariq.
Dear friends, we live in dangerous times, and we live in unpredictable times as well. If anyone had been told or had said 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, or even 25 years ago, that one of the central issues we would be discussing at socialist conferences and socialist meetings and oppositional rallies was Islam or religion, we would have laughed. It was unheard of that this would be a central issue. And one reason for that was that throughout the Cold War period of the last century, the imperialist countries, the United States and its European allies, essentially used Islam as a bulwark, or political Islam, as a bulwark against their enemies all over the world. And it's easy to forget that now, but we shouldn't forget that. Everywhere where the United States was fighting against secular nationalism in the Middle East, against communism in Indonesia, against rising progressive waves of radicalism in South Asia, Pakistan in particular, but not exclusively there, they would use very openly the political organizations which called themselves very proudly Islamist organizations to hammer the enemy. And of course, later, they used these organizations to fight the jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, which had made a terrible mistake, sending its troops trying to shore up an unpopular regime. So one has to see the turn that has taken place in that context. What is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is something that has been artificially engendered, especially in the Western world, against what is regarded as the new enemy. There was no Islamophobia during the Cold War. On the contrary, the Islamophobia, therefore, which is engendered from the top in the Western world and reaches out to some people below, people who should know, some people who should know better, and others, like the extreme right, all over Europe, who utilize it as a weapon against new migrants and their families and their children and their culture. So there are different aspects to this Islamophobia, and it has to be confronted on many different levels. Let us first start with the so-called popular agitation against Muslims. This has very little, in my opinion, to do with an opposition to fundamentalism or Islamic terrorism or anything else, but has everything to do with a hostility to peoples of different cultures living together, and a hostility in particular to the new migrants who came to Europe after the Second World War and who now form between 14 to 18 million people in the European Union. That's the figure. Maybe it's a bit more than that. That's up to 20 million. And the arguments that have been used against them, or are being used against them, are very similar to the arguments that were used against the Jews in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the last century, even prior to the First World War, or the Judaicide of that period. And the arguments on that level, which were used against the Jews, were very simple and straightforward. They were not like us, went the argument. They came from a different culture. They had a different religion. They observed the Sabbath on a different day. They had a strange diet. They didn't eat pork. And they wore funny clothes, kaftans. They had longish hair. They wore funny hats. They spoke a different language. And if you think about it, very similar arguments are used in a broad sense against Muslims today. They are not like us. It's the other. They are part of a different civilization. They shouldn't be here. And one of the issues that comes up time and time again is terrorism. I mean, I was astonished to see how deep this had gone in an opinion poll in this country recently, when it was said that I think 51% of the people questioned. I mean, these polls are never reliable, but nonetheless they're not completely wrong either. Said that 51% of the people, when questioned, said that when they heard the word Muslim, the first thought that came into their mind was terrorist. And if opinion polls had been popular in the 20s and 30s, and people had been asked, they probably would have said, when we hear the word Jew, or when you ask us about Jew, the first word that comes into our mind is Bolshevik. Because the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy was a common trope of the period used by the right-wing and European nationalists throughout the continent. Today, it's not Jewish Bolsheviks, it's Muslim terrorists. And those Jews who were not Bolsheviks were plutocrats. So they got it both ways. There were no ordinary Jews at all. They were either Bolsheviks or multimillionaires. And often you hear that same type of argument against Muslims. Either they're rich Arab sheikhs gambling their country's wealth away in the casinos of Mayfair, which, by the way, is not totally untrue, or they are Muslim terrorists. In between them, there's a huge gap of ordinary people, some believers, some non-believers, who come from or of Muslim origins, some religious, some deeply religious, some mildly religious, some not religious, like every other community in the world. But they're being targeted. And this targeting then produces a counter-response. And this counter-response can take many forms. It can be a pride in one's identity. Many young women who put on the hijab do it for that reason. I mean, I've spoken with many of them. They're not even religious in many cases, but they do it because they're told they can't do it. In France particularly, that is the case. So, this popular semi-racism is very similar in many forms, in many ways, to anti-Semitism that we have already seen. And you know, one thing puzzles me. Given all the education that modern European and Western culture has received on what happened to the Jews during the Second World War, it's never ending. Israelis use it in a cynical way to get their own way in the world. But otherwise, it's something on which people are very well informed. In fact, in a culture in which history is by and large being relegated to the sidelines or virtually binned or taught in modules, the one thing people know about is the Second World War. And so deep does this thing go that some idiot politicians, not so long ago, in the 1990s, late 90s, early 21st century politicians, Tony Blair for one, actually I heard him say on television that the Second World War was a war fought to save the Jews. I mean, just the level of ignorance and cynicism that goes into that remark is quite horrific. I mean, no one asked him from the journals present, well, if that's the case, we lost the war. Because you didn't succeed in saving them. You didn't, in fact, even send your bombers in to bomb one of the concentration camps in which Jews were being held, despite their requests that you do so. Because bombers couldn't be diverted from the main task, which was the destruction of Germany. You know, it was a war. But this is a common view. Okay, we can argue about that, how it should be taught and how it shouldn't be taught, but the effect of it must be very minimal if what is taught is so superficial that the roots of anti-Semitism aren't discussed at all, because were they, then that would also educate the people about treating any minorities in the same way. You would learn some lessons, and those lessons clearly haven't been learned. It's not that Islam is a religion and a culture without a history in Europe. The novels I have written called the Islam Quintet are historical novels set in the period when Islam was a normal, major part of European culture, and in fact a very advanced one, intellectually, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Sicily. And one reason for writing these novels is really to both inform, educate, and entertain people that this was considered normal. And the expulsion of the Muslims and the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th and 16th centuries created the new European identity. And that identity is now being challenged, ironically, by a new influx of Muslims, but mainly migrant Muslims, who come to find work, largely from countries that were colonized by the Western powers. And they are now, a few millions all over Europe. Not huge, but a minority which they feel can't be ignored. And this is creating popular anger. I mean, the National Front in France campaigned very strongly against them. The British National Party in this country campaigned very strongly against the Muslims in the north and in Dagenham. So this is going to go on, and obviously it goes without saying that it has to be resisted, and it has to be combated, and it has to be fought. Not that all the problems that confront the different groups of people of Muslim origin in Europe are the same. Because what racists and liberals blinded by prejudice, or ex-liberals, now neocons blinded by prejudice, like, what is the name of that Daily Mail columnist who used to be on the party? Melanie Phillips. People like that. There's a whole group of them who essentially do little else but produce Islam non-stop. And this has to be resisted. It can't be accepted. We can't just take it lying down. And now we've had, more recently, a scandal within Amnesty International created by people who, once were on the left, challenging Amnesty's defense of political prisoners from Guantanamo. saying that these political prisoners have a bad attitude to feminism. They probably do, so what? You argue with them. I'm not in favor of caving in to anyone on central issues that I believe in, socialism, capitalism, whatever you want. You argue with people. But to say that they shouldn't be given a platform to explain what happened to them in Guantanamo is unacceptable. Or to say that, as the many German Greens did, that the war in Afghanistan was justifiable because we were going to liberate women. The number of German Green women I argued with all over Germany in 2002, 2003, 2004, and it goes on. Now they are learning. 80% of the German population wants out of Afghanistan, and 60 to 70% of the British population wants out of Afghanistan. So some things are beginning to trickle through, of which one is that this wasn't a war to liberate the women of Afghanistan, any more than the Second World War was a war to liberate Jews from Hitler. These things aren't carried out to liberate people, they're carried out essentially to preserve and defend Western interests, whatever they may happen to be or however they are defined at that particular time. So the attitudes are different in different countries, and the migrant populations of Muslim origin, as of any other origin by the way, integrate as best they see fit, and they do so. I mean, in Britain you have Muslim members of Parliament, of New Labour, Muslim members of the Conservative Party, Muslim members of the Lib Dems, and people from Muslim origin in the Socialist Workers' Party and in other groups of the left. Fine, that's normal, that's as it should be. The notion that any one people, any one culture is a huge, undifferentiated blob is never the case. Never was, and never will be. But we know the situation in Europe well. The Germans called their migrants guest workers, so that the name was not thoughtless. If you're a guest, you can always be asked to leave. They were temporary workers. In France, they were French citizens. From the beginning, you're a citizen of a French colony, you're a citizen of the French Commonwealth, you're a citizen of France. And these young kids who went to French schools and were told, when you leave these schools, you're going to be a French citizen with all the rights of a French citizen, and then they find out, surprise, surprise, that 90% of them suffer discrimination when they leave school, leave alone university, in terms of getting jobs. This is all documented. And when the police attack them, and in some cases kill them, these young, new French kids of Muslim origin are so well integrated that they do what the French normally do when they're repressed. They attack property, they build barricades, and they defend themselves. And what would the history of France be without that? 1789, 1793, 1848, 1871, 1968. There's a continuum. And these kids, I tell my French friends sometimes, are so well integrated in your country that they have internalized its history, and you should have more respect for it. And then what do we see in the United States? A similar pattern in a country of immigrants. They're all migrants in the United States. Some went, in the 16th century. Some a tiny bit earlier, but it is a nation, a state rather, of migrants, and they've been very proud of it. And now they are panicking against two sets of migrants, new migrants, Hispanic, who are huge, soon will take that country over. and Muslims since 9/11. But you know, it's so crazy because the overwhelming bulk of the Muslim community in the United States, you know, some millions, are essentially not, most of them are not even workers. They're doctors, engineers, technicians. That's the basis on which they've been let in. Some trickled in by other means, and even they're taxi drivers. I mean, you know, it's difficult to travel in New York without talking to a South Asian taxi driver. Many Muslims, many non-Muslims, but they're all from South Asia. And the language they usually speak in to each other on their mobile phones is Punjabi, which is very good for me because I know exactly what they're up to. But the Islamophobia in the United States grew very strong after 9/11. So that you have communities, the same things happen here. Communities infiltrated by the FBI, here by CID, police intelligence, military intelligence. Communities permanently under watch. Young kids picked up off the streets and interrogated, or creating an atmosphere of fear to tell them that they are being watched. Innocents picked up and deported. This has been going on. And yet the figures are very interesting. Recently, the Rand Corporation, which I promise you is not progressive, you know, by any meaning of the word. It's a very mainstream conservative corporation, but quite serious people, were interested and did a survey. And the survey is very interesting. The RAND report, which you can download, by the way, if you want to read the whole thing, it's quite interesting. The report is called Would-Be Warriors, Incidents of Jihadist Terrorist Radicalization in the United States since September the 11th, 2001. What essentially this report argues, that the incidents involving acts of violence or terror carried out by young Muslims in the United States since 2001 involved a total of 125 people. 46 incidents over 10 years, 125 people. Most of what they did was inept and sloppy. They were basically angry, of which Faisal Shehzad's sort of pathetic effort in Times Square was the last we know of, and there probably will be a few more, but it is so tiny. And the report then points out, which is interesting, that in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, there were 70 terrorist incidents a year. That from January 69 to April 1970 alone, the US, they point out, somehow managed to survive, this is irony, 4,330 bombings, 43 deaths, and $22 million of property damage. This was the weather people from the SDS, hard at work against the Vietnam War. Targeting property, maybe. People would kill some of their own people, but accidentally. They were wrong. But the point which is being made is that this has happened before. That these acts of terror have nothing to do with Islam alone. And it's insignificant, tiny, and a very limited problem. Yet every time it happens, it is blown out of all proportion. Same thing you will recall happened with the July bombings in London some years ago. Islam, 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 Islam. This is inherent in Islam, the new Labour neocon apologists argue. And I got a lot of stick at the time for arguing in The Guardian in public the day after that the reason for this, unacceptable though it was, had to be understood. That unless you understood the causes, you can't do anything, and the causes were Blair's foreign policy then when one of the kids who escaped to Italy and was caught and questioned, and the Italian press published the interview, though they weren't meant to, what did he say? He said, "What do you think we were doing when we were planning all this? Do you think we were reading the Quran? Are you crazy? We were watching videos of the American takeover of Fallujah and the atrocities in Fallujah. And now every single British intelligence report, British Foreign Office report, commission says that it was a response to government foreign policy." Exactly what some of us said the very next day. So, this Islamophobia is useful for the authorities because it helps to keep their own populations worried, and because it helps to justify, in a way, some of the atrocities that are being carried out in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Obama promised to close down Guantanamo. He hasn't managed to do so. But Guantanamo, as some of its inmates tell you, is horrible, but it is nothing compared to the atrocities that are being carried out in Bagram prison outside Kabul in Afghanistan. Daily torture, victimization, cruelties, or the citizens arrested, renditioned, and sent to Egypt and Jordan for a special round of torture. So these things go on, and in order to justify them, you have a generalized Islamophobia, sometimes virulent, sometimes less virulent, as if to say this is terrible, but we have to do it really, because you know what these Muslims are. Essentially, that is what is going on. And how does this square with the so-called human rights ideology of the Western world? It doesn't, of course, but does anyone notice? No. I mean, over 1 million killed in Iraq. Over 1 million people killed in Iraq. And this pathetic Chilcot inquiry which is going on, and God knows when it will produce a report, and the report will probably be nonsense anyway, and then a new government in 10 years' time will set up another inquiry which will take 10 years to report what happened, etc., like they've done with Ireland. That is essentially what is going on. So, it's a political agenda. And that is why it is taken up and used quite openly in the mainstream media to justify American wars and occupations and the support which the European Union has given them. Because anyone who had once assumed that the European Union might be slightly different must by now have realized that actually it follows suit. And that is why there was so much European pleasure at the election of Barack Obama, because at last they thought they had a leader who they could follow happily without being embarrassed. And that too is now becoming embarrassing as he continues the policies of Bush all over the world and at home. It's a real continuity which we're seeing in the United States. Will Islamophobia last forever? I don't think so. Because as I pointed out at the beginning, this is something that was switched on from above, and it can be switched off again when the time comes and when it is needed. And of course, its political basis is a load of nonsense, because the United States now occupies large tracts of the Middle East, with the exception of Iran, on which they have their eyes, which is difficult to pull off at this very moment. Not that they don't want to try, but it's difficult. And in order to occupy these countries, they need Islamophobia. These are dangerous people. They're evil people. That is what New Labour people, cabinet ministers, used to say in private to anyone if you ask them. Why you joined this? Well, you don't know how evil these people are. The word evil became part of political discourse. We are fighting evil. The war of terror is a war against evil. And evil has become now description which can be used against anyone who opposes the United States. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is regarded as evil. And it's interesting, when they attack Chavez, they say he's evil because he hates America, and he mixes with the wrong sort of people, and the people he mixes with are the leaders of Iran or Hezbollah or the Palestinians. And that makes him evil. And of course, behind this also lies now the absolute desperation with which the United States carry on backing the Israeli state, despite its policies and despite open crimes committed in public view. But they carry on defending them. And the fact that the Vavi Marmara was a boat in which there were Turkish citizens, that boat was targeted. They were Turks. Even though Turkey is a NATO ally, they were Muslims. Or if you look at another appalling situation which exists on the globe, the continuing repression, rape, torture, imprisonment of Kashmiris in what is effectively Indian-occupied Kashmir. I mean, there are horror stories that have not come out from there. Or they are known, but they're not published in the media. And that too is because the majority of the population are Muslims. And the Indian government too has got caught up in this war on terror. There were Israeli generals who visited Kashmir to give advice, because of course we know how expert they are at dealing with Palestinians, so they gave advice on how you can deal with your Palestinians. But now in India you have other problems too. Not just against Muslims, but against a Maoist peasant insurgency in different parts of the country, and exactly the same sorts of tactics are being used against them. So this is a situation which is going to continue. If you read the American press on South America, those people are evil. They're evil because they're challenging the United States, so none of them is a Muslim. Islamophobia is used against against the Islamic world, and it's from that point of view, one of the tragedies, if you like, on one level of the Islamic world is that the bulk of the world's cheap oil lies underneath Muslim lands, and so it is used against them non-stop. As for the notion that Islam promotes terrorism, this is so bizarre and so pathetic that it doesn't even deserve a reply. But since this is so widespread that somehow within, in the deepest recesses of Islamic culture, there is violence, it should be replied to. That Europe forgets its own history. Europe forgets that in the late 19th and early 20th century there was a wave of terrorist attacks that were carried out. Presidents were killed, cafes were blown up, and the people who did it was a particular segment of anarchists. Not all anarchists, but a particular segment of anarchists who said this was the propaganda of the deed, and that this was how they would build the new world, through destroying the old, in a literal sense. That's how they used to justify it. Now, in attacking the Islamophobic tendencies, which I think we should do, there's absolutely no question about that in my mind. We mustn't forget that those of us who consider ourselves socialists can't just do that, because we have another task. And that is to win people over to the ideas that the capitalist system is irrational, that the capitalist system essentially benefits a minority, that the capitalist system is prone to crisis, that the capitulation of social democracy throughout Europe to neoliberal capitalism has been a disaster for those who supported it, and that in the vacuum that exists, many things sprout, some bad and some good. And it is our duty as socialists to make sure that the plants we plant today grow and are nurtured. Because after all, we believe in a society where there is genuine popular sovereignty on every level, in factory and farm, in locality, in region, in country. That is the socialism we believe in, and it is only through a system like that that many of the old cobwebs can be swept aside in a world which can't sweep them aside. And in a world which creates huge vacuums, all religions will thrive. Because Marx never simply said that religion is the opium of the people. It is, but he went on further in that paragraph and rightly pointed out that it is the heart of the heartless world and it is the sigh of the oppressed. And the communist and socialist movements and their collapse over the last 50 years has been a disaster. Rebuilding is going to take a long time. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be done. And that is our answer. It must always be our answer to those who seek shortcuts by small violent terror attacks on buildings or individuals. These things don't work. They're a 7-day wonder. They give ammunition to the enemy. They never actually work, and they have never yet succeeded in transforming society. And that is a message which, as socialists, we have also to say to many, many young Muslims who are reluctant yet to understand that this is the way forward. Thank you.
Now, the way that it works is that you might have seen people walking around holding slips. Dozens and dozens of people have actually put in slips to speak. So we've got a nice cross-section of the different things that people want to say. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the speakers up 2 at a time. There's a mic down here at the front, so there's also one in the middle as well. So just make your way to whichever one is closest to you. The first speaker will be Richard Boyd Barrett from the SWP in Ireland, followed by Ian Newson from Lambeth. And while Richard's coming down, I've got a couple of questions that I want to read out as well. The first is from Saber Phillips, saying, you mentioned artificial creation of Islamophobia. What do you mean by this? Is it a consciously driven effort made by elites?
Yeah, well, just following on from Tariq's very powerful introduction, I just wanted to talk about the amazing parallels really that exist between the treatment of Muslims and the phenomena of Islamophobia and the same phenomena in Ireland previously, and really how Ireland was a forerunner. Although I have to say, before I do that, I mean, one example of what it just struck me as Tariq was talking about how these phenomena, at least partly, are just engineered from above, and the extraordinary cynicism, if you like, of our rulers, struck me for my sins. I remember watching Rambo films in the mid-1980s. And did anybody remember Rambo 3? And the hero of Rambo 3 was a Muslim prince who could even be loosely based on Osama bin Laden. And he was the hero of the film, alongside Rambo, subjugating, trying to drive out the communist threat. But move the picture on 20 years, and it's very different. And indeed, similarly in Ireland, I mean, Britain, when it suited them in the 19th century to subjugate the Irish people, which they did in a vicious, systematic way with the penal laws, anti-Catholic penal laws, the famine, which essentially resulted from that, a massacre really of the Irish population in the 19th century, used anti-Irish racism and the idea that the Irish were culturally underdeveloped, the Catholic Irish were culturally underdeveloped, that they were barbaric. This had all sorts of reflections in the popular media in Britain. Even if people read Wuthering Heights, the character of Heathcliff is found as a foundling in Liverpool, probably coming from Ireland, from the famine, and he's a wild, dangerous character. So this was the image, if you like, of the Irish, used to justify the subjugation of the Irish. But when it suited Britain, they used the Catholic Church to crush the Fenian movement and radical movements that were agitating over land issues and against the British presence. And in that context, not surprisingly, where people were discriminated against systematically essentially because of the fact they lived in Ireland, and Britain wanted to control Ireland and exploit Ireland and use religion and race as a justification for doing that, inevitably, of course, a significant, substantial strand of the resistance, of the Irish resistance movement and of the Irish revolutionary movement expressed itself in terms of Catholic religion and a celebration of Irish nationalism. And quite rightly, people like James Connolly, revolutionary socialists like James Connolly, didn't stand aside from that, as some on the left did at the time, and say, because you're not socialist, we won't stand with you, but understood that the job of a revolutionary is always to stand with the oppressed, regardless of what banner they fight, under, religious or otherwise. And just to finish the point, there were some people criticising the Irish Revolution because it was led by nationalists and Catholics, including priests. Lenin, quite rightly, writing from Russia in 1916, the Irish National Revolt, praised the Irish Revolution and criticised those who were criticising it, and said anybody who thinks a revolution is about the workers lining up on one side and the bosses lining up on another will never live to see a revolution. In reality, revolutions are complicated, they have all sorts of ideas, and the key issue, are we with the oppressed, are we with the resistors, or are we with those who want to put them down?
I'm going to give each speaker 3 minutes, and when you've got 1 minute left, I'm going to tap on the mic, and at 3 minutes I'm going to have to shut you off, just so you know. I think it was actually Jan Newson from Lambda. While she's coming up, there's another question as well from Lawrence from Essex. How do you respond to the use of progressive and feminist discourse to repress Muslims and fuel Islamophobia?